Hey,
Cuzzupoli.
I know there's so many of them. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Morning, Amy.
So, because of the, I don't know if you want to call it a holiday, tomorrow, I chose an Indigenous person to talk about today. Oh, louder, right. So, as people here know, most of America doesn't know this stuff, but you all know it, but I'll say it anyway. Violence and discrimination against Native American Indigenous people are legacies of this country's history of racial injustice. The United States has done very little to acknowledge the genocide of Native Americans or the myth of racial difference created to justify the removal of Native people and the forced assimilation of their children done by sending them to boarding schools where thousands were abused and killed. Native Americans endure not only the highest police violence rates, but also the highest poverty and suicide rates in the country. There is also the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which leaves the families of these women with nowhere to turn for answers or justice. Even though Native people were 2.2 times more likely to be killed by police than white people, and 1.2 times more likely to be killed than black people, their voices are rarely heard regarding police violence. Today I'm going to speak to you about Jonathan Tubby. I got my information for this from a few news articles, and then there's actually a 2-hour podcast that I found online that is some of Jonathan's family members, I believe 2 aunts, being interviewed, and they talked about the incident, and so I kind of just pieced it all together from that. What makes this case a little different than most of the others is that it's stretched over a long period of time. It wasn't just it was bad decisions, but it wasn't just one bad decision. You know, so many times the shooting occurs in like 10 seconds or something. So that's something to keep in mind. It's a little bit different. So 26-year-old Jonathan Tubby was killed by a Green Bay, Wisconsin police officer on October 19th, 2018. Jonathan was Native American from the Oneida Nation. He loved to dance, sing, and make people laugh. He was compassionate and took care of everybody he loved. He was very athletic and enjoyed football and lacrosse. Jonathan was fun-loving and free-spirited, never passed judgment, and had friends from all walks of life. If you were good to him, he was good to you. Around 7:30 p.m. that October evening, Jonathan and his aunt, who was a passenger in his car, were pulled over by 2 police officers for rolling through a stop sign. Officer O'Brien and Officer Warnicki, who was in training. After running a check on their identification, the officers discovered that there was a felony warrant out for the arrest of Jonathan related to an OUI, operating a vehicle under the influence of alcohol. Jonathan and his aunt were asked to get out of the car. Officer Warnicki searched and handcuffed Jonathan. His aunt was put in another car which had come to the scene. Jonathan was put in the back seat of O'Brien and Warnicki's police vehicle. Video from the squad car during the ride shows Jonathan squirming around in the back seat. Even though he was handcuffed behind his back, he somehow managed to get his hands into the front of his body. He can be seen on the video with his hands balled up under his shirt. Officers later stated that Jonathan had not given them any trouble during the ride to the police station. The ride to the station seems to be somewhere around 30 minutes, kind of a long ride. After arriving at the station, one of the officers opens the car door and shines a light on Jonathan and says, "He has a gun." The officer closes the car door. Arrest protocol was broken immediately as jailers from the precinct are supposed to come out and get the suspect, but the 2 officers who had arrested him were the ones trying to remove him from the vehicle. The false narrative of the officer's words, "He has a gun," quickly spread, and within minutes there were up to 20 law enforcement individuals on the scene, including SWAT members and canine dogs and professionals from a crisis intervention. The family would later learn through depositions that as Jonathan sat in the car, discussions took place on how to remove him peacefully. At least 2 non-lethal plans were discussed. Jonathan was in the car sobbing and occasionally moving around and leaning over. His family thinks he knew what was coming. One officer said he was making animal noises. The family says this was their way of dehumanizing Jonathan, who was crying. At around 9 p.m., an armored Bearcat vehicle pulls up and officers can be heard yelling, "Show us your hands, show us your hands." Also on the audio is sounds of people talking and laughing. Because remember, there's like at least 20 people gathered around this scene outside the precinct. The car windows are fogged, and at one point the officers ask Jonathan to wipe the windows, which he does. He continues moving around and is sweating profusely. He can also be heard mumbling and swearing, but not screaming. It appears that officers just lost patience and got tired of the situation, as they had been at the precinct now roughly 30 minutes, and remember that the first contact with Jonathan had happened at like 7:30 and it's after 9 now. So the next thing that happens is a police officer fires at the rear car window, shattering it, and then continues breaking the space of the opening of the back seat of the car. Jonathan can be heard saying, "What are you guys doing to me? Somebody help me." Cops continue to yell, "Show us your hands." And he says, "I can't, I'm scared." He can be seen curling up in a corner of the car and moving around. Some minutes later, an officer sprays him in the face with OC tear gas. Jonathan, stunned, immediately climbs out of the back car window, the one that the police had shattered. Keep in mind that this would have been impossible because he's handcuffed if he'd have also been holding some sort of a firearm in his hands. This is when the car video stops. Neither officer was wearing a body cam, but there is some footage from bystanders. Jonathan is now standing on the back of the car when he is shot with beanbag bullets. He falls off the car and onto the ground and is lying on his stomach, still handcuffed, with his hands over his head, clearly not in possession of a weapon. At some point, one of the canine dogs is on top of Jonathan and he's bitten. Officer O'Brien, just lost my tragic point in the story. Officer O'Brien then shoots 8 bullets, 5 of which hit Jonathan in the back, head, and neck, killing him almost instantly. Officer O'Brien would later say that he thought the sound of the beanbag shots was Jonathan firing a weapon, even though there's no weapon. Later testimony by other officers present showed that none of them confused the sound of the beanbag gun firing to that of a bullet-firing gun. Only Officer O'Brien, who as it turns out was a firearms instructor, mistook the sound. Media reports said that Jonathan was high, suicidal, and aggressive, even though he had no history of violence. This was typical character assassination of the victim. An officer not involved that night later told Jonathan's aunt that he had dealt with him in the past and he was never a problem. Both officers were put on paid leave following the incident. The family would come to learn that Officer O'Brien, who killed Jonathan, had been less than dishonorably discharged from the Army and had left his military service off of his application completely when he applied to the police force. He had also been charged with disorderly conduct prior to his employment with the police and had 3 complaints against him for using excessive force while on duty. The family was unable to find out the details of his dismissal from the Army, but O'Brien did admit to having depression and anxiety. People assume that there's mandatory extensive background checks done on police officers, but this certainly was not the case with Officer O'Brien. Officer O'Brien was never punished punished for falsifying his application or using excessive force and ended up getting promoted. Prosecutors declined to bring charges against the officers. His family sued the officers involved, as well as the former police chief, the city of Green Bay, and Brown County, claiming Jonathan's constitutional rights were violated and that officers weren't properly trained. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with the lower court ruling that the officers did not violate Jonathan's rights when he was fatally shot. The federal judge dismissed the claim, saying that the family's assertion that Jonathan was unarmed was based on hindsight and that the officer reasonably believed that he had a gun. In 2021, an appellate court added that unqualified immunity shields the officer who shot Tubby from liability, Jonathan. There was no admission of any procedures ever being broken by any officers involved in the incident. The family is fighting to have mental health evaluations for all police officers. Please join me while we kneel for Jonathan Tubby.